The summer of 1931 was unbearable in New York City. Heat clung to the streets long after sunset, forcing families out onto stoops and sidewalks in search of air that never came. Children played late into the night, while adults leaned from open windows, watching over them. Then, without warning, gunfire shattered the routine of a quiet East Harlem block. A shotgun blasted from a moving car, followed by the sharp cracks of a pistol. When the echoes faded, 5 children lay bleeding on the pavement. One of them, a 5-year-old boy, would die the next day. The intended target walked away untouched. By morning, newspapers across the city carried the same name, printed in heavy black type: Vincent Coll. From that moment on, New York would know him by a single title: the Baby Killer. To understand how a 23-year-old man became the most hated figure in the city, it is necessary to understand the world that produced him. Prohibition-era New York was a place where crime flourished openly. Alcohol was illegal, but demand was insatiable, and organized crime filled the gap with ruthless efficiency. Speakeasies operated behind false doors, beer trucks moved through the city like armored convoys, and entire neighborhoods were carved up into territories worth killing for. Violence was not a last resort. It was the foundation on which power rested. In this environment, killers were not hidden in the shadows. They were promoted, protected, and feared, and young men growing up on the streets learned quickly that brutality was the fastest route to status. Vincent Coll did not begin his life in violence. He was born in a small, impoverished village in County Donegal, on the rugged northwest coast of Ireland. At the beginning of the 20th century, places like Donegal offered little opportunity, and emigration was often the only path forward. When Vincent was still an infant, his family joined the wave of Irish immigrants crossing the Atlantic in search of a better life. They arrived at Ellis Island and eventually settled in the Bronx, a borough overflowing with newcomers struggling to establish themselves in a crowded and unforgiving city. For a brief time, Vincent's childhood was relatively stable. His family was not among the poorest, and there was a sense of structure in his early years. That stability collapsed quickly. His mother died while he was still young, leaving a wound that never healed. A few years later, his father abandoned the family entirely, unable or unwilling to cope with the loss. With the adults gone, Vincent and his siblings were left drifting between relatives and institutions. Schools and reformatories attempted to impose discipline, but they offered no sense of purpose. To Vincent, education felt meaningless in a world where death had already claimed so much of his family. By his early teens, Vincent had turned away from school and toward the streets. The Bronx in the early 1920s was rough, crowded and violent, but it also offered something Vincent lacked elsewhere: belonging. Street gangs provided identity, protection and clear rules. Loyalty was rewarded, weakness was punished, violence brought respect. Vincent proved to be particularly adept at this way of life. Arrests came early and often, and by the time he was still a teenager, he was already known to police as a repeat offender and to criminals as someone willing to go further than most. It did not take long for more powerful figures to notice him. In the underworld, talent is recognized quickly, especially when that talent involves fearlessness and a willingness to kill. Through local gangs, Vincent came into contact with established Irish mob figures, including Oni Madden, one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York. Madden represented what Vincent aspired to become: a man who commanded respect, controlled territory, and moved through the city untouchable. Vincent learned by watching, absorbing the lessons of power and intimidation, but he also revealed something unsettling. Where others used violence as a tool, Vincent seemed to embrace it as his defining trait. Prohibition accelerated everything. With alcohol outlawed, bootlegging became the most profitable criminal enterprise in the country, and New York was its capital. In the Bronx, no figure loomed larger than Dutch Schultz, a paranoid, brutal bootlegging kingpin who ruled through fear and absolute control. Schultz needed men who would enforce his will without hesitation, men who would shoot when told and ask no questions afterward. Vincent Coll fit perfectly. He began guarding beer trucks, intimidating speakeasy owners, and quickly graduated to more serious work. His fearlessness and brutality made him invaluable, and before long, he was functioning as Schultz's primary enforcer. Vincent's reputation grew rapidly. Stories spread of his willingness to kill in public, to use overwhelming force, and to leave bodies as warnings. He dressed sharply, spent freely, and enjoyed the attention his notoriety brought. The newspapers described him as handsome and charismatic, a man who might have been a movie star in another life. Vincent began to believe those stories. He saw himself not as a hired gun, but as a central figure in the underworld. A man whose name carried weight independent of any boss. That belief marked the beginning of the end. Dutch Schultz tolerated violence, but he did not tolerate ambition that challenged his authority. Schultz paid his men fixed wages and expected unquestioned loyalty in return. Vincent wanted more money, more recognition, and eventually more power. Tension grew quietly between the two men, masked by shared enemies and ongoing business. Vincent was no longer content to pull the trigger on command. He wanted to decide who deserved to be shot. By the close of the 1920s, New York stood on the brink of a bloodbath it could not yet see. Vincent Coll, the Irish immigrant who had lost his family and found purpose in violence, had risen quickly through the ranks of organized crime, but his hunger for status and independence was pushing him toward a direct confrontation with one of the most dangerous men in the city. The world that rewarded brutality was about to unleash its consequences, and Vincent Coll was about to step from feared enforcer into something far worse. Vincent Coll crossed the line the moment he decided he no longer needed permission. By 1929, his reputation as Dutch Schultz's most dangerous enforcer was firmly established, but reputation alone didn't pay for the lifestyle Vincent believed he deserved. While Schultz was notoriously tight-fisted, paying his men flat weekly wages and keeping the lion's share of profits for himself, Vincent lived fast and spent recklessly. Tailored suits, silk shirts, expensive clubs, flashy cars. He wanted the world to see him not as a hired gun, but as a king in the making. The problem was that kings do not take orders, and Dutch Schultz had built his empire on absolute obedience. The breaking point came when Vincent, along with fellow Schultz associate Carmine Berrelli, carried out a massive robbery without authorization. Disguised as guards, they walked into a Bronx dairy business and calmly walked out with an enormous sum of cash, all without firing a shot. It was a rare moment of restraint in Vincent's career, but it enraged Schultz more than any murder ever could. To Schultz, it wasn't about the money, it was about control. No one operated independently, no one embarrassed him. When Schultz confronted Vincent, he expected contrition. What he got instead was defiance. Vincent made it clear that it was his violence, his reputation, and his methods that had helped build the Schultz empire, and he demanded to be treated as an equal. Schultz refused. His only partner was dead, and no one would ever replace him. From that moment on, the relationship was poisoned. Vincent remained on Schultz's payroll, but the trust was gone. Schultz saw Vincent as a threat he had created, while Vincent saw Schultz as an obstacle standing between him and power. Quietly, Vincent began laying the groundwork for his own crew. Many of Schultz's men were unhappy, underpaid, overlooked, and trapped under a boss who rewarded loyalty with suspicion. Vincent offered something different: better money, shared profits, and the promise of rising with him instead of being crushed beneath someone else. Carmine Berrelli quickly became a liability. After the robbery, tensions over money escalated, and Vincent suspected Berrelli would inform Schultz about his plans to break away. In Vincent's world, suspicion was enough. One cold February night in 1930, Verily and his girlfriend were gunned down in a sudden ambush as they walked home. The attack was brutal, efficient, and unmistakably Vincent's work. Once again, he avoided serious consequences. Witnesses vanished, evidence dissolved, the streets understood the message. Clearly, Vincent Coll was no longer playing by Schultz's rules. The murder of Verily forced Schultz's hand. What had once been simmering tension became open warfare. Vincent officially broke away and formed his own organization, quickly dubbed by the press as the Coll Gang. His crew included some of the most violent men Schultz had once relied upon. Gunmen who knew the Bronx, knew the routes, knew the hideouts, and knew exactly how Schultz operated. Vincent's older brother Peter became his right-hand man, the one person Vincent trusted completely. Together, they had grown up in hardship, learned crime together, and now stood united against one of the most powerful gangsters in New York. At first, the city waited for chaos that didn't immediately come. Schultz had other problems. Law enforcement pressure was increasing, and he was still obsessed with settling scores against rival gangs. This temporary distraction gave Vincent time to solidify his position, expand his territory, and enjoy the illusion that he had outsmarted his former boss. But peace in Prohibition-era New York was never permanent. It was only the pause before the next eruption. When violence resumed, it did so with precision. Men associated with Schultz began turning up dead, shot outside clubs, ambushed in cars, executed in garages. Vincent knew he couldn't win by simply killing foot soldiers. Schultz could replace men endlessly. Instead, Vincent attacked infrastructure. Beer trucks were destroyed. Warehouses were sabotaged. Schultz's income stream was targeted deliberately, cutting at the one thing Schultz valued more than human life: money. Schultz responded in kind. Tips were exchanged, spies were planted, and death became a daily expectation. The streets filled with whispers. Everyone knew this war was personal. This wasn't just about territory, it was about pride, betrayal, and revenge. And then Schultz struck where Vincent was weakest. Peter Coll was driving through Harlem late one night when gunmen pulled alongside his car and opened fire. He was hit repeatedly. By the time police arrived, Vincent's brother was dying. Peter Coll did not survive the night. For Vincent, the loss was devastating. He had lost family before, but this was different. Peter was his anchor, his partner, the last connection to a life before the bloodshed. Schultz hadn't just attacked his gang, he had shattered Vincent's world. Grief quickly turned into rage. Vincent abandoned any remaining restraint. The killings escalated in frequency and brutality. Schultz associates were hunted relentlessly, shot in public spaces, executed in front of witnesses, and left as warnings. Property was vandalized, trucks were burned, businesses were destroyed. Vincent wasn't trying to win quietly anymore. He wanted Schultz to suffer, to feel hunted, to understand that there would be no peace. Eventually, the violence became so disruptive that even Schultz sought a temporary truce. The war was costing him men, money, and attention from authorities. Vincent agreed to stand down in exchange for cash and territory, but neither man believed the peace would last. It was a pause born of exhaustion, not forgiveness. Beneath the surface, hatred remained intact. With his own bars and rackets now under his control, Vincent enjoyed the profits of independence. But freedom brought new problems. Maintaining a large crew required constant income, and Vincent's appetite for money and notoriety only grew. He turned to kidnapping, a crime that shocked even seasoned criminals. At first, he targeted mob figures, confident they wouldn't involve police. Then he expanded to businessmen and celebrities, extracting massive ransoms while terrifying the city's elite. The underworld began to turn against him. Kidnapping crossed an unspoken line. It brought unwanted attention, destabilized profits, and threatened everyone. Vincent didn't care. He wanted money, power, and fame, and he wanted them now. What he failed to understand was that fear without respect creates enemies everywhere. By the time Vincent Coll entered the 1930s, he was no longer just a gangster. He was a problem. One too violent to control, too reckless to tolerate, and too visible to ignore. The city hadn't yet seen the worst of him, but it was coming fast, and when it arrived, it would make Vincent Coll the most hunted man in America. Vincent Coll's turn toward kidnapping marked the moment when fear curdled into hatred. Until then, his violence, however extreme, had largely stayed within the accepted boundaries of Prohibition-era gang warfare. Killings were expected, ambushes were understood, but kidnapping was different. It brought families into the equation. It forced people who believed themselves insulated by wealth or status to experience the same terror as those on the street. And most dangerously, it threatened to expose money flows that even hardened criminals preferred to keep hidden from the government. Vincent understood this leverage perfectly, and he exploited it without hesitation. He began with fellow mobsters, confident they would never go to the police. To do so would invite questions from the IRS about where ransom money came from and why it had never been declared as income. The logic was sound and it worked. Men were taken, held in hidden rooms, threatened, and released once payment was made. No reports, no witnesses, no consequences. Encouraged by success, Vincent escalated. He turned his attention to businessmen and entertainment figures, people whose families could raise large sums quickly. Each successful ransom emboldened him further, feeding both his bank account and his ego. Among the most notable victims was Rudy Vallee, a nationally famous singer and radio star. His kidnapping sent shockwaves through New York society. The Coll gang received a massive payout, and the message was unmistakable. No one was untouchable. Soon after came Sherman Billingsley, owner of one of the city's most famous nightclubs. Again, money changed hands, and again, Vincent walked away untouched. Bankers followed, club owners followed. Each case deepened the sense that Vincent Coll had become a law unto himself. But while the public grew terrified, the underworld grew furious. Kidnapping disrupted business. It brought heat. It frightened people who were supposed to feel safe within the criminal ecosystem. Even men who had once admired Vincent's audacity now viewed him as a liability. He was unpredictable, ungovernable, and increasingly obsessed with notoriety. What Vincent wanted most was respect, but his methods ensured the opposite. He was feared, but he was not admired. And fear without respect is fragile. Nowhere was this clearer than among his own Irish community. Despite his wealth and notoriety, Vincent was never embraced as a hero. At an Irish fundraising event meant to help struggling immigrants, he expected recognition, even admiration. Instead, he was met with silence, avoidance, and open discomfort. People who shared his background wanted nothing to do with him. Some even left the event entirely upon his arrival. To them, Vincent Coll was not a success story. He was an embarrassment, a violent reminder of the stereotypes they were trying desperately to escape. The rejection cut deeply. Vincent lashed out publicly, dismissing the Irish community as small-minded and cowardly, accusing them of lacking ambition and settling for mediocrity. The remarks only widened the gap. By this point, Vincent had managed to alienate nearly everyone: rival gangs, former allies, community leaders, and even the people who shared his heritage. The only person who remained consistently by his side was his girlfriend, Lottie Kruger, a tough, streetwise woman who understood violence as well as he did. Together, they lived in hotels and apartments, moving constantly as pressure mounted. That pressure exploded in the summer of 1931. Vincent's war with Dutch Schultz, though temporarily paused, was never truly over. Schultz had lost men, money, and face because of Vincent. He waited patiently, knowing that time and exposure were on his side. Vincent, by contrast, grew more reckless. He wanted a decisive blow, something that would end Schultz's influence permanently. His target became Joey Rao, a high-ranking Schultz associate who had escaped multiple attempts on his life. On a sweltering evening in East Harlem, Vincent and his men spotted Rao outside a social club. Children were playing on the sidewalk. Adults lingered near open windows. None of that mattered. Vincent ordered the attack. A shotgun blast tore into the crowd, followed by pistol fire. Rao escaped yet again. 5 children were hit. One of them, Michael Vanari, was mortally wounded. He died the following day. The city erupted in outrage. This time there was no ambiguity. The press named Vincent Coll outright. Photographs of the dead child's grieving mother filled newspapers. Politicians demanded action. Police Commissioner Edward Mulrooney authorized unprecedented measures, including shoot-on-sight orders if officers encountered Vincent or his known associates. Mayor Jimmy Walker publicly branded him Mad Dog, a nickname that stuck instantly. The FBI placed Vincent at the top of its most wanted list. In a city accustomed to violence, this was different. This was intolerable. Vincent went into hiding, dyeing his hair, growing a mustache, and limiting his movements. He rented rooms under false names, avoided public appearances, and trusted almost no one. But even on the run, he couldn't stop. He continued attacking Schultz's operations, sabotaging garages, destroying trucks, and murdering associates whenever opportunity arose. Each act tightened the net around him. Informants emerged, former allies began talking. The walls closed in. Desperate for a way out, Vincent approached Jack Legs Diamond, another notorious gangster who had his own history with Schultz. Vincent proposed an alliance, suggesting they abandon New York and expand bootlegging operations elsewhere. Diamond listened. He even considered it. But the timing was wrong. Law enforcement attention was intense, and Vincent's name had become radioactive. Before any plans could solidify, police struck first, arresting members of the Coll gang in rapid succession. Vincent himself was arrested and charged with the murder of Michael Vanari. Public opinion demanded his execution. Newspapers openly speculated about his death sentence. Mayor Walker made it clear he wanted a swift conviction. Yet against all expectations, Vincent survived the trial. His defense attorney dismantled the prosecution's case, discrediting the key eyewitness and exposing him as unreliable. The jury acquitted Vincent. Once again, he walked free. The acquittal stunned the city and enraged his enemies. Vincent emerged more isolated than ever. His gang was depleted, his finances were strained, his reputation was beyond repair. And yet, instead of retreating, Vincent made the most catastrophic decision of his life. He accepted a contract to assassinate Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was not just another gangster. He was one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, a man reshaping the Mafia into a modern, efficient enterprise. The contract came from Salvatore Maranzano, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, who feared Luciano's growing influence. The payout was enormous, the largest ever offered for a mob hit. Vincent accepted without hesitation, but Luciano learned of the plot first. He moved quickly and decisively. Maranzano was murdered in his office before Vincent could act. In the aftermath, Luciano discovered Vincent's involvement. That discovery sealed Vincent Coll's fate. Luciano placed a massive bounty on his head. Dutch Schultz matched it. Overnight, Vincent became the most hunted man in New York, with a price so high that every professional killer in the city took notice. From that moment on, Vincent Coll was living on borrowed time. He was broke, betrayed, hunted and alone, clinging to the illusion that old loyalties might still save him. He believed that Oni Madden, his former mentor, would protect him. He was wrong. The city had turned. The underworld had decided. And the final act of Vincent Coll's short, violent life was about to begin. By early 1932, Vincent Coll was a dead man walking, even if he refused to admit it. The bounty on his head had changed everything. This was no longer a personal feud or a territorial dispute. Money at that scale rewired the underworld. Men who had never met Vincent, men who didn't care about Schultz, Luciano, or old grudges, were suddenly studying his habits, his hideouts, and his few remaining associates. $100,000 was enough to erase loyalty, memory, and hesitation. In Prohibition-era New York, it was a fortune large enough to make murder feel like a business transaction rather than an act of revenge. Vincent felt the shift immediately. Doors that once opened for him stayed shut. Messages went unanswered. Familiar faces disappeared from bars and clubs the moment he entered. Even criminals understood that being seen with Vincent Coll was an invitation to die. His gang, once large and feared, had been gutted by arrests, defections, and killings. The men who remained were exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly unreliable. Vincent trusted almost no one. He moved constantly, rarely slept in the same place twice, and carried the weight of the bounty with him like a shadow. Despite this, he still believed he could negotiate his way out. Vincent had always survived by forcing others to back down. He had beaten prosecutors, intimidated witnesses, and outlived rivals who were supposed to kill him. In his mind, this was just another crisis to manage. What he failed to understand was that this time the decision had already been made. The underworld didn't want him controlled, exiled, or humbled. It wanted him erased. One of the great ironies of Vincent Coll's final days was that he placed his trust in the very people who had the strongest incentive to see him dead. He believed that old Irish connections still meant something, that shared history could outweigh money and pressure. In particular, he trusted Oni Madden, the man who had once mentored him and introduced him to the mechanics of power. Vincent convinced himself that Madden, despite everything, would protect him from the storm gathering around him. In reality, Madden had already made his calculation. Vincent Coll was bad for business. He brought chaos, publicity, and relentless law enforcement scrutiny. His kidnappings had angered powerful people. His violence had crossed lines that even hardened criminals wanted preserved. And most importantly, his existence threatened the stability of the underworld at a moment when Italian organized. Crime was consolidating power under a new, more disciplined structure. Vincent wasn't just dangerous anymore, he was obsolete. While Vincent drifted between hotels and safe houses, professional killers closed in. Among them were men with no emotional connection to the story, only a financial one. They didn't hate Vincent, they didn't fear him. They saw him as a payday. Tips filtered in, sightings were reported, every movement narrowed the window. On the night of February 7th, 1932, Vincent was staying once again at the Cornish Arms Hotel on West 23rd Street, a place he returned to out of habit and misplaced comfort. With him was Lottie Kruger, the one constant in his collapsing world. He was tired, broke, and deeply aware that his options were running out. That night, Vincent received word that Oni Madden wanted to speak with him. A meeting was proposed, framed as a chance to resolve lingering tensions and possibly broker peace with his enemies. To Vincent, it sounded like salvation. Shortly after midnight, Vincent left the hotel to make a phone call confirming the details. He crossed the street to a small drugstore, one of those ordinary places that blend into the city so completely they feel invisible. Inside, he stepped into a phone booth at the back. He carried no weapon. He had only a few dollars in his pocket. For a man who had lived by the gun, it was an uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability. Unbeknownst to Vincent, the trap was already set. Outside, a darkened car waited. One of the men inside had confirmed Vincent's identity moments earlier. There would be no warning, no negotiation, no chance to run. This wasn't a street brawl or an ambush gone wrong. It was an execution. The gunman entered the drugstore calmly, passing the clerk without incident. He approached the phone booth from a few feet away, raised a Thompson submachine gun, and pulled the trigger. The weapon emptied its magazine in seconds. Bullets tore through glass, metal and flesh. Vincent Coll never stood a chance. His body collapsed forward, riddled with wounds to his face, chest and arms. The violence was overwhelming, deliberate and final. The killers fled immediately, disappearing into the city before police could react. When officers arrived, Vincent Coll was already dead. He was 23 years old. Word spread fast. Crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of relief. For months, Vincent's name had dominated headlines, associated with dead children, kidnappings, and unchecked brutality. His death felt, to many, like justice finally catching up. There was no public mourning, no romanticized farewell. The city exhaled. Lottie arrived at the scene soon after, forcing her way through the crowd, screaming in grief. She refused to cooperate with police, answering questions with half-truths or not at all. Loyalty, at least, survived to the end, but loyalty could not change the outcome. Vincent Coll's funeral was sparsely attended. Few people were willing to be seen honoring him. He was buried in the Bronx beside his brother Peter. Even in death, his isolation was complete. Dutch Schultz sent a funeral wreath, a final cold acknowledgement of their shared past. It was less an expression of respect than a reminder of who had won. The men responsible for Vincent's death did not enjoy long lives. As was often the case in that era, violence consumed its own. Some were murdered. Others were executed by the state. The cycle continued, indifferent to individual stories. Vincent Coll's end did not bring peace to New York, but it did remove a destabilizing force that neither the underworld nor the authorities could tolerate. In the aftermath, the city moved on quickly. Organized crime reorganized under new leadership. Kidnappings became taboo. Public violence became more calculated. Vincent's legacy hardened into a cautionary tale rather than a legend. He was remembered not as a mastermind or a kingpin, but as a warning of what happens when ambition outruns discipline and fear replaces respect. Vincent Coll had wanted to be admired. He wanted recognition, power, and a place among the great figures of the underworld. Instead, he became something else entirely, a symbol of excess, recklessness, and brutality pushed too far. His rise was meteoric, his fall inevitable. In a city that rewarded violence, he proved that there was still a limit, and crossing it meant extinction. Vincent Coll's death did not bring the kind of closure people expected. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden end to violence in New York, no sense that order had been restored. Instead, what followed was something quieter and more unsettling: adaptation. The underworld absorbed the lesson Vincent Coll had taught it at tremendous cost. His rise and fall became a reference point, a warning whispered in back rooms and social clubs. Power could be taken quickly, but holding it required discipline, restraint, and above all, discretion. Vincent had mastered fear, but he had failed to understand control. In the days after his killing, newspapers briefly reveled in the story. Headlines spoke of justice, of a city finally rid of its most hated criminal. Editorials condemned his brutality and framed his death as inevitable. Yet beneath the moral language was a simpler truth. Vincent Coll had become bad for everyone's business. The public outrage following the killing of a child had forced politicians and police to act in ways they usually avoided. The attention was relentless, and it threatened to expose the delicate web of corruption that allowed organized crime to operate smoothly. By dying, Vincent removed the pressure valve. Life, for those still standing, could return to something resembling normal. Dutch Schultz benefited immediately. With Vincent gone, one of his most dangerous internal threats vanished. Schultz regained control over territory that had been contested, and for a brief time, he reasserted his dominance in the Bronx. But even Schultz understood that the landscape had changed. The violence of the late 1920s and early 1930s had drawn too much attention. Public officials were becoming less tolerant, not more. Federal investigators were beginning to focus not just on murders, but on finances. Tax evasion, once an afterthought, was becoming a lethal weapon in the government's arsenal. Schultz himself would not survive the decade. His paranoia intensified after Vincent's death, not eased. He saw enemies everywhere and believed betrayal was inevitable. His refusal to adapt to the new, more centralized structure of organized crime would eventually seal his fate. But in the immediate aftermath of Vincent Coll's killing, Schultz lived, and he watched carefully as the underworld reorganized around him. That reorganization was driven largely by Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Vincent's final mistake, agreeing to take a contract on Luciano, had placed him squarely against the future of organized crime in America. Luciano represented a new way of thinking. He had no patience for chaotic violence or emotional vendettas. He believed crime should function like a corporation, with clear rules, shared profits, and minimal public exposure. Vincent Coll was everything Luciano despised: reckless, egotistical, and uncontrollable. Luciano's consolidation of power following Salvatore Maranzano's death marked a turning point. The old system of a single boss of bosses was replaced by a commission designed to prevent exactly the kind of internal wars that had fueled Vincent's rise. Kidnapping, in particular, became taboo. It was too unpredictable, too likely to draw federal attention. Vincent's tactics were studied not as models to follow, but as mistakes to avoid. Oni Madden, perhaps the most complicated figure in Vincent's story, also moved on quickly. Madden had survived long enough to recognize that the era of Irish dominance in New York's underworld was fading. Italian and Jewish syndicates were better organized, more disciplined, and increasingly interconnected. Madden distanced himself from the chaos that had defined Vincent's final years and eventually left New York altogether. His survival was not a matter of luck, but of adaptation. He understood what Vincent never did, knowing when the game had changed. For Vincent's girlfriend, Lottie Kruger, the aftermath was bleak. She played the role expected of her, silent, uncooperative, loyal to the end, but loyalty offered no protection. Within months, she was arrested for her own crimes and sent to prison. When she was eventually released years later, she vanished from public record, changing her name and disappearing into anonymity. In a strange way, she achieved what Vincent never could: an escape from the story. Among the public, Vincent Coll's name lingered longer than his influence ever had. He became a symbol, often exaggerated, sometimes distorted. To some, he was proof that Prohibition had failed catastrophically. To others, he was a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and moral decay. His youth fascinated people. 23 years old, barely more than a boy. The idea that someone so young could cause so much destruction fed the myth-making instincts of the press. Yet among criminals, the myth was thinner, sharper, and far less flattering. Vincent was remembered as talented but undisciplined, brave but foolish, dangerous but ultimately predictable. He relied too heavily on fear and too little on alliances. He mistook notoriety for power. In the underworld, those mistakes are fatal. One of the most enduring lessons of Vincent Coll's life was the danger of visibility. He loved attention. He courted the press, dressed conspicuously, and behaved as though fear alone could shield him. But attention invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites consequences. The men who survived longest in organized crime were those who stayed quiet, who let others take credit, and who avoided becoming symbols. Vincent wanted to be a star in a world where stars burn out quickly. The killing of the child in East Harlem ensured that Vincent would never be remembered on his own terms. Whatever else he had been, an immigrant, a product of trauma, a violent opportunist, he became irrevocably the baby killer. That label erased nuance. It hardened public opinion and unified forces that were usually fragmented. Police, politicians, journalists, and even rival criminals found common cause in removing him. Once that happened, his fate was sealed. Vincent Coll's story also exposed the limits of corruption. For years, bribery and intimidation had shielded men like him from consequences. Witnesses disappeared, charges were dismissed, juries were influenced. But corruption works best when it remains invisible. Vincent's excesses made invisibility impossible. His actions forced the system to react, not out of virtue, but out of self-preservation. Too much exposure threatened everyone. In the broader arc of American organized crime, Vincent Coll represents a transitional figure. He belonged neither fully to the old, chaotic street gang era, nor to the modern syndicate structure that followed. He was caught between worlds, using outdated methods in a system that was evolving past him. His failure was not just personal, it was structural. The environment that rewarded his rise could no longer tolerate his behavior. By the mid-1930s, New York's underworld looked very different from the one Vincent had dominated briefly. Violence did not disappear, but it became more calculated. Public shootings became rarer, killings were quieter, cleaner, and often hidden. The lesson was clear: chaos attracts attention, and attention destroys profits. Vincent Coll had been chaos incarnate. Today, Vincent Coll's name survives largely through documentaries, books, and crime histories. He is often portrayed as a feral psychopath, a madman, driven purely by bloodlust. That image is incomplete. Vincent was also a product of displacement, loss, and a city that rewarded cruelty. Understanding him does not excuse him, but it does explain how someone so young could rise so fast and fall so hard. His life forces uncomfortable questions. What happens to children raised in environments where violence is normalized? How much responsibility lies with individuals and how much with systems that reward brutality? Vincent made his choices, but those choices were shaped by a world that consistently told him violence worked. In the end, Vincent Coll got what he always wanted, though not in the way he imagined. He became famous, his name endured, but the fame was poisonous, stripped of glamour or admiration. He was remembered not as a kingpin, not as a mastermind, but as a warning. The streets he once terrorized absorbed his absence quickly. New names replaced his, new rivalries formed, new fortunes rose. That is the final cruelty of history. It does not pause for villains or victims. It moves forward, indifferent to individual suffering. Vincent Coll's story is not one of redemption or tragedy in the classical sense. It is a story of acceleration, of a young man who discovered that violence could give him everything he wanted until it took everything from him. His life burned bright and brief, illuminating the darkest corners of Prohibition-era New York before extinguishing itself. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates, not because he was exceptional, but because he was extreme. He pushed the logic of his world to its limit and found out where that limit was. In doing so, he helped reshape the underworld that destroyed him. When Vincent Coll died on the floor of a small Manhattan drugstore, riddled with bullets, it wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of a style of criminal. A reminder that in a city built on ambition and violence, survival belongs not to the loudest or the most feared, but to those who know when to disappear. Vincent Coll's story cannot be separated from the era that produced him, because Prohibition did more than criminalize alcohol. It criminalized ambition for an entire generation of young men who saw no legitimate path upward. In immigrant neighborhoods across New York, the American dream felt distant and abstract. Factories paid little. Advancement was slow. Respect was hard to earn. Organized crime, by contrast, offered immediate rewards. Money came quickly. Status came violently. And for men like Vincent Coll, who had grown up surrounded by loss and instability, the underworld didn't just offer opportunity, it offered meaning. Prohibition created a marketplace where brutality was not a flaw, but an asset. The federal government had outlawed a product millions still wanted, and enforcement was inconsistent, corrupt, and underfunded. This gap was filled by criminal syndicates that operated with military efficiency and street-level ruthlessness. Bootlegging demanded logistics, protection, and enforcement meant men who could intimidate, maim, and kill without hesitation. Vincent Coll thrived in this environment because it rewarded exactly what society elsewhere rejected in him. What made Vincent different from many of his contemporaries was not simply his violence, but his inability to regulate it. Other gangsters understood limits, even if they rarely spoke of them openly. There were rules about visibility, about collateral damage, about which crimes brought heat and which could be absorbed quietly. Vincent Coll ignored those boundaries. His kidnappings, his public shootings, and ultimately the killing of a child pushed violence beyond what the underworld could tolerate. In doing so, he revealed a truth that organized crime preferred to keep hidden. Its survival depended on restraint as much as brutality. As the early 1930s progressed, the federal government began adapting as well. Traditional policing had failed to contain organized crime, largely because it was compromised by corruption. The response was strategic rather than moral. Prosecutors like Thomas Dewey focused on financial crimes, tax evasion, and conspiracy, charges that didn't rely on witnesses who could be intimidated or killed. This shift marked the beginning of the end for many Prohibition-era figures who had once seemed untouchable. Vincent Coll never lived long enough to face that new reality, but his actions accelerated the process by making continued inaction politically impossible. In many ways, Vincent was a transitional figure, caught between two eras of American crime. He belonged to the older world of street gangs and personal vendettas, where reputation was built face-to-face and power was asserted openly. But he was operating in a system that was moving towards centralized control, corporate-style organization, and calculated discretion. Men like Lucky Luciano understood that chaos was bad for business. Vincent Coll embodied chaos, and that made him expendable. His Irish background also matters in understanding his isolation. Irish-American dominance in New York's underworld had been waning for years by the time Vincent rose to prominence. Earlier figures like Oni Madden had achieved power through organization and political connections, but by the 1930s, Italian and Jewish syndicates were better positioned to dominate. They had broader alliances, shared profits across ethnic lines, and were less prone to internal fragmentation. Vincent, despite his ambition, never truly integrated into this evolving structure. He alienated allies faster than he made them and mistook fear for loyalty. Among historians, Vincent Coll is often described as a psychopath or a madman, labels that simplify a far more complex reality. He was capable of planning, of restraint when it suited him, and of loyalty to a select few. What he lacked was foresight. He could not imagine a future that required him to change. The same traits that propelled his rise, impulsiveness, aggression, hunger for recognition, made adaptation impossible. In a system that increasingly valued stability, Vincent remained committed to disruption. His obsession with respect is particularly telling. Vincent wanted to be admired, not just feared. He dressed the part, spoke confidently to reporters, and cultivated an image of success. But respect in the underworld is earned through reliability and predictability, not spectacle. By kidnapping innocents and drawing massive public attention, Vincent ensured that no one could ever trust him. He became a liability to every organization he touched. The reaction of the public to Vincent Coll's crimes also marked a shift in how Americans viewed organized crime. While gang violence had long been a feature of city life, the killing of a child cut through the usual indifference. It personalized the consequences of prohibition in a way statistics never could. Mothers saw their own children in the headlines. Politicians saw their careers at risk. Even criminals recognized that the social contract that protected them, silence in exchange for containment, had been violated. Vincent Coll's death was therefore not just an act of vengeance or profit. It was a form of damage control. Removing him restored a fragile balance between crime, corruption, and public tolerance. That balance would not last forever, but it bought time for the underworld to restructure and for law enforcement to refine its methods. In the decades that followed, the mythology of Prohibition-era gangsters would grow, fueled by films, novels, and nostalgia. Figures like Luciano, Capone, and Lansky would be portrayed as brilliant anti-heroes, men who built empires in defiance of flawed laws. Vincent Coll rarely received such treatment. His story resisted romanticization. There was nothing clever about shooting into a crowd of children. No strategic genius could be extracted from his final acts. His legacy was too raw, too ugly, too indiscriminate. And yet his story endures precisely because it exposes the darker truth beneath the mythology. Organized crime was not glamorous. It was unstable, predatory, and often driven by men who had learned violence before they learned restraint. Vincent Coll was not an anomaly. He was an extreme example of a system that rewarded cruelty until it became inconvenient. In studying Vincent Coll, we see how quickly power can turn into isolation, how ambition without discipline becomes self-destruction, and how systems built on fear eventually consume those who rely on it most. His life reminds us that violence may open doors, but it rarely builds foundations. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the world Vincent Coll had known was already fading. New criminal structures emerged, more corporate, more secretive, and far less tolerant of unpredictability. The streets were quieter, not because crime had vanished, but because it had learned to hide better. Vincent Coll would have struggled in that world. He was too loud, too visible, too volatile. His story, then, is less about a single man and more about a moment in history. A brief window when chaos reigned and young men could rise and fall with terrifying speed. Vincent Coll burned through that window faster than almost anyone else, leaving behind a trail of blood, fear, and unanswered questions. In the end, Vincent Coll did not fail because he was weak. He failed because he was excessive. He pushed a violent system to its breaking point and discovered that even the underworld has limits. His life serves as a reminder that when power is built solely on fear, it collapses the moment fear turns universal. Vincent Coll's life also offers a rare window into the psychology of extreme violence in young offenders, particularly those shaped by instability rather than ideology. He was not driven by politics, ethnic loyalty, or even long-term criminal vision. What motivated him was simpler and more volatile: recognition, control, and the belief that fear could substitute for security. Modern criminologists would describe him as a product of cumulative trauma rather than a born killer. Early loss, abandonment, exposure to street violence, and repeated contact with a system that punished but never redirected him created a personality that learned one lesson very well: aggression worked. From a psychological perspective, Vincent Coll displayed many traits associated with high-risk offenders who rise quickly in criminal hierarchies and fall just as fast. He was impulsive, sensation-seeking, and deeply sensitive to perceived disrespect. Violence was not just a means to an end, it was emotionally regulating for him. Each act reinforced his sense of agency in a world where he had once felt powerless. This helps explain why he escalated rather than retreated when pressure mounted. Backing down would have required him to confront vulnerability, something he had learned to avoid at all costs. Gang dynamics further amplified these tendencies. Street gangs and early mob crews functioned as surrogate families, especially for young men cut loose from traditional support systems. Loyalty, masculinity, and dominance were constantly tested. In such environments, restraint can be mistaken for weakness. Vincent learned quickly that brutality earned approval, protection, and advancement. By the time he entered higher levels of organized crime, those patterns were ingrained. He did not know how to operate in a system that demanded patience, compromise, and strategic invisibility. This is where Vincent Coll diverged sharply from figures like Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky. Those men were not less violent by nature, but they were more selective. They understood timing, delegation, and optics. They used violence sparingly, as punctuation rather than constant noise. Vincent, by contrast, made violence the entire sentence. His inability to modulate. His behavior made him effective in the short term and disastrous in the long term. The transition occurring in organized crime during the early 1930s mirrored broader changes in American society. The chaos of prohibition was giving way to reform, federal oversight, and a more technocratic approach to law enforcement. Criminal organizations that survived did so by evolving into quieter, more bureaucratic entities. Violence did not disappear, but it became internalized and hidden. Vincent Coll represented the opposite trajectory, a man whose methods belonged to an earlier, messier phase of criminal development. His downfall also highlights the role of collective decision-making within the underworld. Contrary to popular depictions, mob justice was rarely impulsive. Vincent was not killed because one man hated him, but because many powerful figures independently reached the same conclusion. He destabilized markets, he attracted attention, he violated unspoken agreements. His death was not emotional, it was administrative. Once that decision was made, execution was inevitable. From a modern lens, Vincent Coll's kidnapping campaign is particularly significant. Kidnapping violates one of the few boundaries that criminal organizations tend to enforce universally. It threatens outsiders, invites federal involvement, and destabilizes trust. In today's organized crime structures, kidnapping is often outsourced or avoided entirely for these reasons. Vincent's willingness to target businessmen, entertainers, and civilians demonstrated either a profound miscalculation or a complete disregard for long-term consequences. Either way, it accelerated his isolation. The killing of the child in East Harlem was the irreversible tipping point. Even in environments saturated with violence, there are symbolic lines that cannot be crossed without consequences. That act unified disparate interests, law enforcement, politicians, rival criminals, and the public into a single objective. Vincent Coll was no longer a criminal problem to be managed. He was a liability to be removed. Once society converges on a single narrative, escape becomes nearly impossible. Vincent's age is often cited as a curiosity, but it is central to understanding his behavior. He died at 23, an age when impulse control and long-term planning are still developing neurologically. In a stable environment, that immaturity might have resulted in reckless mistakes. In the underworld, it resulted in mass casualties. Vincent was given adult power without adult constraints, and the result was catastrophic. His story also challenges the romanticism often applied to gangster history. Vincent Coll was not building a legacy or an empire. He was reacting, constantly, aggressively, and short-sightedly. He did not plan for succession, alliances, or survival. He lived in the present tense, and when the present turned against him, he had no future to retreat into. For modern audiences, Vincent Coll serves as a counterpoint to the myth of the criminal genius. Not every feared figure is intelligent, strategic, or visionary. Some rise because systems reward the wrong traits at the wrong time. When those systems change, such individuals are left exposed. Vincent Coll was brilliant at exploiting chaos, but chaos eventually exhausted itself. The end of Prohibition closed the chapter that made men like Vincent possible. When alcohol became legal again, profit margins shrank, competition decreased, and violence lost its economic justification. Organized crime adapted by diversifying and professionalizing. Vincent's style, public, excessive, attention-seeking, became obsolete almost overnight. Had he lived longer, he likely would not have survived the transition. In the final analysis, Vincent Coll's life is less about morality and more about systems. He was shaped by immigration, poverty, trauma, and an era that rewarded aggression. He was destroyed by the same forces when they no longer needed him. His story reminds us that environments create incentives, and incentives shape behavior, sometimes with devastating results. Vincent Coll wanted to be remembered. He wanted recognition, admiration, and fear. He achieved all three, but not on his own terms. History remembers him not as a kingpin or innovator, but as a warning sign, a moment when violence overwhelmed control and forced a reckoning. And that may be his most lasting impact. By showing how far chaos could go, Vincent Coll helped define how far it could not. His life marked the outer boundary of acceptable criminal behavior in Prohibition-era New York. Beyond that boundary lay extinction. Vincent Coll's story did not end with his death. In many ways, it only began there. What followed was a process familiar to every era of violent crime. Transformation into narrative. Newspapers, radio commentators, and later historians stripped his life into symbols that could be consumed, debated, and remembered. In doing so, they shaped how the public understood not just Vincent Coll, but the entire Prohibition era. He became a character more than a person, a shorthand for uncontrolled brutality in a decade already crowded with notorious names. The media played a decisive role in this transformation. Prohibition-era journalism thrived on spectacle. Gangsters sold papers and editors knew it. But Vincent Coll was different from the figures who dominated headlines before him. He lacked charm, polish, and strategic mystique. Where others were portrayed as clever bootleg kings or shadowy masterminds, Vincent was presented as raw violence incarnate. The nickname Mad Dog was not accidental. It stripped him of humanity and framed him as something feral, irrational, and beyond redemption. Once that label took hold, nuance disappeared. This mattered because public memory tends to freeze people at their worst moment. For Vincent Coll, that moment was the killing of a child. Everything else, his upbringing, his losses, even his earlier crimes, was swallowed by that single act. In true crime narratives, this is a familiar pattern. The most emotionally shocking event becomes the lens through which the entire life is interpreted. In Vincent's case, it ensured that he would never be romanticized the way other gangsters were. There would be no sympathetic reinterpretations, no anti-hero revival. His image was fixed. Over time, Vincent Coll became less a historical figure and more a cautionary archetype. He represented what happens when violence escapes containment. In books and documentaries, he is often positioned as a contrast to more successful criminals, men who understood limits, alliances, and discretion. This framing serves an important cultural function. It reassures audiences that there is a logic to criminal power, that chaos is punished and order rewarded, even within illegal systems. Vincent Coll's story reinforces the idea that excess leads to self-destruction. True crime as a genre has only intensified this effect. Modern audiences are drawn to stories that explain how ordinary or marginal individuals become capable of extraordinary violence. Vincent Coll fits that template almost perfectly. He was young, immigrant, traumatized, and shaped by his environment. His rapid escalation and equally rapid collapse provide a complete arc that feels both shocking and inevitable. This makes his story endlessly reusable, retold in different formats for different generations. Yet something is often lost in these retellings. By focusing solely on Vincent as a monster, the systems that enabled him fade into the background. Prohibition, corruption, political indifference, and economic desperation are reduced to setting rather than cause. This simplification makes the story easier to digest, but it also makes it less accurate. Vincent Coll did not operate in a vacuum. He was tolerated, protected, and employed by powerful figures until he became inconvenient. Only then was he removed. Public memory also tends to personalize blame. It is comforting to believe that removing one bad individual solves a problem. Vincent's death created the illusion that New York had rid itself of a uniquely dangerous threat. In reality, violence continued, just in different forms. The underworld did not become moral. It became quieter. Vincent Coll was not an exception. He was an extreme expression of a system that continued to function long after he was gone. The absence of glamour in Vincent Coll's legacy is itself revealing. American culture has often been willing to mythologize criminals who appear disciplined, intelligent, or rebellious in controlled ways. Vincent offered none of that. His crimes were ugly, indiscriminate, and impossible to justify. He kidnapped innocents. He terrified families. He shattered any illusion that gang violence was victimless. In doing so, he became unmarketable as a folk hero. History remembers him not because he was admired, but because he was feared and rejected. Even within Irish-American communities, his memory remained complicated. Earlier generations of Irish immigrants had struggled to escape stereotypes of criminality and disorder. Vincent Coll's notoriety threatened that progress. Rather than being embraced as a symbol of success, he was viewed as a liability, someone whose actions reflected badly on everyone who shared his background. This collective rejection further isolated his story from the kind of ethnic pride narratives that buoyed other gangsters' reputations. As decades passed, Vincent Coll's name faded from popular consciousness, resurfacing mainly in academic works, crime histories, and niche documentaries. Unlike Al Capone or Lucky Luciano, he did not become a household name. But among those who study organized crime, his story remains significant precisely because it illustrates the boundaries of tolerance within criminal systems. He shows what happens when violence ceases to be instrumental and becomes expressive, when it is driven by ego rather than strategy. Modern true crime audiences often ask why someone like Vincent Coll did not stop, even when survival demanded it. The answer lies in identity. By the time he was on the run, Vincent had no alternative self to fall back on. He was the Mad Dog. Fear was not just his weapon, it was his sense of self. To abandon violence would have meant abandoning who he believed he was. That psychological trap is common among individuals whose entire status depends on intimidation. In this way, Vincent Coll's story resonates beyond its historical moment. It mirrors patterns seen in modern gang violence, extremist movements, and criminal subcultures where notoriety is currency. The tools change, the platforms evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain strikingly similar. Visibility brings power. Power invites attention. Attention attracts suppression. Those who cannot adapt are removed. Vincent Coll did not understand the difference between being known and being protected. He chased the former until it destroyed the latter. That distinction is one of the most important lessons his life offers, both to historians and to anyone trying to understand how violent systems sustain themselves. By the time Vincent Coll was buried, the narrative had already solidified. He was no longer a man shaped by circumstances, choices, and failures. He was a symbol. Symbols are easier to remember than people, but they are also easier to misunderstand. Vincent Coll's life resists easy categorization precisely because it sits at the intersection of individual pathology and systemic failure. His story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It asks whether societies that reward violence should be surprised when violence becomes uncontrollable. It challenges the notion that criminal systems can self-regulate indefinitely, and it exposes the fragile line between fear as a tool and fear as a destabilizing force. In the end, Vincent Coll's legacy is not measured by territory controlled or money earned, but by the reaction he provoked. He became the moment when everyone, criminals included, decided that enough was enough. His name endures not because he won, but because he went too far. Vincent Coll's life forces a deeper question that goes beyond one man or one era. Why do some criminals become indispensable while others become expendable? From a criminological and policy perspective, Coll sits at the extreme edge of this answer. He was useful until he wasn't, protected until he became a liability, tolerated until the cost of tolerance exceeded the benefits. His story illustrates how illegal systems, much like legal ones, operate on cold calculations rather than loyalty, morality, or emotion. Organized crime is often misunderstood as a chaotic free-for-all, but in reality, it functions as a risk management system. Violence is a tool, not a goal. The purpose of violence is to stabilize income, enforce agreements, and deter interference. As long as violence serves those ends efficiently and discreetly, it is tolerated or even rewarded. Vincent Coll violated this principle repeatedly. His violence did not stabilize anything. It destabilized markets, provoked public outrage, and forced unwanted attention from authorities. In modern criminological terms, he generated negative externalities so severe that they threatened the entire enterprise. From the perspective of criminal organizations, Coll's greatest sin was not cruelty, but unpredictability. Predictability allows planning. It allows alliances. It allows corruption to function smoothly. Coll was impulsive, emotional, and reactive. He escalated conflicts instead of resolving them. He ignored cost-benefit calculations in favor of personal gratification, revenge, and recognition. Once this pattern became clear, his removal was not just desirable, it was necessary. Policy failures also loom large in Vincent Coll's rise. Early interventions were either absent or ineffective. The juvenile justice system cycled him through institutions that emphasized punishment without rehabilitation. Schools expelled him rather than supported him. Police arrested him repeatedly, but never disrupted the environment that rewarded his behavior. In effect, the system taught him that violence carried consequences only when it threatened powerful interests. Until then, it worked. Prohibition itself was a massive policy experiment that failed to account for enforcement realities. By criminalizing a widely desired product without adequate infrastructure to regulate or suppress its distribution, the government created a black market of unprecedented scale. That market required enforcers. Men like Vincent Coll were not anomalies. They were logical outcomes. The state outsourced violence to criminals by default, then expressed shock when that violence spilled into public spaces. The killing of a child forced a policy correction, not because the state suddenly became moral, but because political risk became unavoidable. Public tolerance evaporated. Newspapers amplified outrage. Officials who had previously looked the other way were forced to act. Vincent Coll's death was as much a response to public relations pressure as it was to criminal logic. He became expendable when he endangered legitimacy, both of the state and of organized crime. Modern criminology often distinguishes between instrumental violence and expressive violence. Instrumental violence serves a purpose: money, control, deterrence. Expressive violence is driven by emotion, anger, ego, identity. Vincent Coll increasingly operated in the expressive mode. His actions were not just about profit, they were about proving something, to rivals, to communities that rejected him, and to himself. This shift made him dangerous in ways that could not be managed or predicted. This is why attempts to negotiate peace with Coll repeatedly failed. Even when truces were arranged, they were temporary and fragile. Vincent did not view agreements as binding constraints, but as tactical pauses. He returned to violence not because it was necessary, but because it was familiar. For criminal organizations trying to reduce volatility, such behavior is intolerable. Another key factor in Coll's expendability was his isolation. Successful criminals rarely stand alone. They embed themselves in networks of obligation and mutual benefit. Vincent burned bridges faster than he built them. He kidnapped allies. He insulted communities. He threatened former bosses. By the end of his life, almost no one had an incentive to protect him. His social capital had collapsed. Contrast this with figures like Lucky Luciano. Luciano survived far longer, not because he was less violent, but because he distributed power, shared profits, and minimized unnecessary conflict. He understood that long-term survival in illegal systems depends on cooperation as much as intimidation. Vincent Coll understood only domination, and domination without consent is unstable. There is also a generational dimension to Coll's downfall. He came of age during the most chaotic years of Prohibition, when structures were still forming and violence was rampant. As the system matured, tolerance for instability decreased. Coll did not adapt to this shift. Younger criminals often assume that the conditions of their rise will persist indefinitely. Coll made that mistake, and the environment moved on without him. From a modern policy standpoint, Vincent Coll's story underscores the danger of focusing solely on individuals rather than systems. Removing him did not end organized crime. It refined it. Violence became less visible, more strategic, and harder to prosecute. The problem was not solved, it was optimized. This pattern repeats across history. Crackdowns remove the most visible offenders while leaving underlying incentives intact. His story also highlights how societies decide whose lives are redeemable. Vincent Coll was young, but he was not seen as salvageable. By the time he was labeled the baby killer, public narratives foreclosed any possibility of rehabilitation. This does not mean rehabilitation was realistic, but it does illustrate how labels accelerate outcomes. Once a person becomes a symbol of everything society fears, elimination becomes easier to justify. Modern gang researchers note similar patterns today. Individuals who generate excessive attention, draw media focus, or escalate violence beyond acceptable thresholds are often targeted not just by law enforcement, but by their own organizations. They become liabilities. Vincent Coll is an early extreme example of this phenomenon. His end also challenges simplistic moral binaries. Coll was not killed by the state for his worst crime. He was killed by other criminals because he disrupted stability. Justice and utility intersected only incidentally. This distinction matters because it reveals that systems of power, legal or illegal, prioritize order over morality. Vincent Coll's life therefore serves as a case study in how violence is regulated, tolerated, and ultimately rejected within criminal ecosystems. It shows that even in worlds built on brutality, there are rules, often unspoken, often cynical, but real nonetheless. Crossing those rules does not make one powerful, it makes one disposable. As historians and criminologists continue to examine Prohibition-era crime, Vincent Coll remains a useful reference point. He marks the boundary between chaos and control, between old-world street violence and modern organized crime. His failure was not that he was violent, but that he was too visible, too emotional, and too unwilling to subordinate himself to systems larger than his ego. In the end, Vincent Coll's expendability was not sudden, it was cumulative. Each kidnapping, each public shooting, each insult to allies added weight to the calculation. By the time the decision was made, it felt inevitable to everyone involved. The only person who did not fully grasp it was Vincent himself. His story reminds us that power without structure is temporary, that fear without consent is brittle, and that systems, legal or illegal, will always sacrifice individuals to preserve themselves. Vincent Coll believed he was indispensable. History proved otherwise. Vincent Coll's life, when viewed in full, does not unfold like a rise and fall legend, but like a collision between a man and the limits of the world he inhabited. He was born into hardship, shaped by loss, and educated by a city that rewarded aggression faster than patience. New York in the Prohibition years did not merely tolerate violence, it incentivized it. For a young man with little to lose and much to prove, brutality became a ladder. Vincent climbed it faster than almost anyone, and because he climbed so fast, he never learned how fragile it was. What ultimately destroyed Vincent Coll was not simply the killing of a child, though that act sealed his public fate. It was his inability to evolve. Organized crime, like any system of power, changes over time. The men who survived longest were those who sensed when chaos needed to give way to order, when visibility needed to give way to discretion. Vincent could not make that transition. He mistook notoriety for strength and fear for loyalty. He believed that if people were afraid of him, they would always need him. History proved the opposite. By the end of his life, Vincent was profoundly alone. The gangs that once followed him had thinned out. The bosses who once employed him wanted him gone. The communities he came from rejected him. Even the city that had made him famous was eager to see him erased. In his final moments, standing unarmed in a phone booth, Vincent Coll was stripped of every illusion he had built around himself. There was no power left, no leverage, no reputation strong enough to stop what had already been decided. His death was quick, brutal, and unceremonious, much like the violence he had inflicted on others. And just as quickly, New York moved on. That may be the most unsettling part of his story. For all the fear he generated, for all the blood spilled, his absence created a sense of relief rather than loss. The underworld adjusted, law enforcement recalibrated, new names replaced his in the papers. The machine kept running. Vincent Coll wanted to be remembered as a force, someone who mattered. In that sense, he succeeded. His name still appears in histories of Prohibition-era crime, studied as an example of what happens when violence outruns strategy. But he is not remembered as a builder, a visionary, or even a particularly clever criminal. He is remembered as a boundary, a reminder of how far brutality can go before it becomes self-defeating. There is a temptation, especially in true crime storytelling, to search for redemption or meaning in lives like Vincent Coll's. His story resists that impulse. It offers no redemption arc, no final insight that transforms suffering into wisdom. What it offers instead is clarity. It shows how environments shape behavior, how systems reward certain traits until they become liabilities, and how individuals who cannot adapt are discarded without sentiment. Vincent Coll was neither a mastermind nor a mindless killer. He was something more uncomfortable, a young man who learned the wrong lessons very well. He learned that violence works until it doesn't. He learned that fear opens doors until it closes all of them. He learned that power can be taken quickly but cannot be held without restraint. In the end, Vincent Coll's story is not about one gangster. It is about a moment in American history when laws, markets, and morality collided and produced extreme outcomes. His life marks the point where Prohibition-era chaos reached its limit and forced a transformation. After him, crime did not disappear, but it learned to be quieter, colder, and more calculated. That transformation came at a cost, paid in lives like Vincent's and in the lives of those who crossed his path. Children, families, bystanders, people who never consented to the world he helped create. Their suffering is the part of the story that cannot be abstracted or analyzed away. Vincent Coll died young but not unfinished. His choices ran their course. His world responded exactly as it was designed to. In a system built on fear, he became too frightening. In a business built on stability, he became too unstable. and so he was removed. What remains is not admiration, but a lesson written in blood and silence. Violence may build reputations, but it does not build futures. Systems that reward cruelty will eventually reject those who take it too far, and history, indifferent and unsentimental, will remember not the excuses but the consequences. That is the story of Vincent Mad Dog Coll,